Sections. The sun was low over the Montana grasslands when Elias Kane rode the fence line for the third time that week. The wire was taut, the posts solid, but he checked them anyway because checking them was what a man did when he had nothing else to fill the hours between dawn and dark. The wind moved through the buffalo grass in long waves, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. His horse, a big roan gelding named Red, walked with the patience of an animal that knew its rider had nowhere particular to be. Parpervor, Elias was 42 years old and had been alone for 6 of them. His wife Sarah had died in the winter of 1879, her lungs finally giving out after 3 hard Montana winters that she'd never been strong enough to survive. The ranch had been hers before it was theirs, be left to her by a father who'd staked the claim in the gold rush days and stayed when the gold ran out. Elias had married into it, worked it, and when Sarah died, he'd kept working it because work was the only language he knew how to speak to grief. The cabin sat in a shallow valley with a creek running behind it and a stand of cottonwoods that gave shade in summer. It was a good piece of land, isolated enough that neighbors were a day's ride in any direction. Elias preferred it that way. He rose before light, made coffee in the same tin pot he'd used for a decade, ate bread and jerky standing at the counter, and went out to the work. He mended fence, rotated the small herd of cattle between pastures, cut hay, hauled water, repaired the barn roof, oiled the tech, and when all of that was done, he found something else that needed doing. In sections. Red's ears flicked forward. Elias felt it before he saw it, the gelding's body tensing, his gait shortening. Elias lifted his eyes from the fence wire and looked north toward the creek crossing. There was movement there, something dark against the pale grass. He touched his heels to Red's sides, and the horse moved forward at a walk, then a trot. She was collapsed at the edge of the creek, half in the water and half on the bank. Her dress was torn, dark fabric that might have been blue or black, soaked through and clinging to her body. Her hair was black as a crow's wing, loose and tangled with creekweed. She wasn't moving. Parpervor. Elias swung down from the saddle before Red had fully stopped. He splashed into the shallow water and dropped to one knee beside her, his hand going to her shoulder. She was cold. The creek was snowmelt, and barely above freezing, even in late summer. He turned her over and saw her face. High cheekbones, skin the color of copper, lips tinged blue. Native. Young, maybe 25. There was a bruise darkening her temple and a cut above her eye that had bled down the side of her face. Frau. She was breathing. Shallow, but breathing. Elias didn't think. He slid his arms under her knees and shoulders and lifted her out of the water. She was small, lighter than he'd expected, and limp as a rag doll. He carried her to Red, and the gelding stood solid while Elias hoisted her up across the saddle. He swung up behind her, settled her weight against his chest, and turned the horse toward home. The ride back took 20 minutes. She didn't wake. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and her breath came in short, uneven pulls. Elias kept one arm around her waist to keep her from sliding, and the other on the reins. Red walked smooth and steady, like he understood the cargo was fragile. Parpervor. The cabin was dim and cool inside. Elias kicked the door open and carried her straight through to the small back room that had been Sarah's sewing room, and then a storage room, and was now just empty space with a narrow bed and a window that looked out on the cottonwoods. He laid her on the bed and stepped back. Water pooled on the floorboards beneath her. Parpervor. He built a fire in the main room's hearth first, fast and hot, then filled a kettle and set it to boil. He found blankets in the chest at the foot of his own bed and brought them back to the small room. She was shivering now, which he took as a good sign. Shivering meant the body was fighting. These sections. Elias stood in the doorway and looked at her soaked dress and then at his own hands. He was not a man comfortable with the intimacy of undressing an unconscious woman, but he was also not a fool. Wet clothes and cold would kill her as sure as the creek would have. Bro. He turned his back and spoke to the empty room. I'm going to get you out of those wet things. You'll freeze otherwise. Bro, she didn't answer. He hadn't expected her to. Wow, he worked quickly and kept his eyes on his hands. The dress had buttons down the back, small and waterlogged, and difficult to manage with his thick fingers. When he finally got it open, he peeled the fabric away from her shoulders and arms, then lifted her enough to pull it down and off. Underneath, she wore a simple cotton shift, also soaked. He hesitated, then pulled that off too. He wrapped her in a dry blanket before he let himself look at her again, and even then, he only looked at her face. Sections. The bruise on her temple was darkening. The cut above her eye had stopped bleeding, but needed cleaning. He brought the kettle and a clean rag and washed the blood away with careful, deliberate movements. She didn't wake. When he was done, he covered her with 2 more blankets and left a cup of water on the small table beside the bed. Peror. He hung her wet clothes on a line he strung near the fire, and then he sat in his chair by the hearth and waited. She woke near midnight. He heard the bed creak and then a soft sound, not quite a gasp. He stood and walked to the doorway. She was sitting up, the blankets clutched to her chest, her eyes wide and dark and fixed on him. There was no fear in her face, just assessment. She looked at him, at the room, at the window, at the door behind him. Calculating. Per hour for her. Elias raised both hands, palms out. You're safe, he said. You were in the creek. I brought you here. Per hour. She didn't speak. Her eyes moved to the cup of water on the table. Elias gestured to it. You should drink. Per hour. She reached for the cup slowly, like she expected him to stop her. When he didn't move, she lifted it to her lips and drank. She drained the cup and set it down. Her hands were shaking. Pierre. I'll get you more, Elias said. He went to the kitchen and refilled the cup from the bucket by the door. When he came back, she was still sitting up, still watching him. He set the cup on the table and stepped back to the doorway. There's food if you're hungry. Bread and some dried meat. I can make something hot if you want. Paragraphs. She looked at him for a long time. Then she shook her head once, a small, precise movement. All right, Elias said. You rest. I'll be out here if you need anything. Parafer. He pulled the door halfway closed and went back to his chair. He didn't sleep. He sat and listened to the fire crack and settle, and the sound of her breathing in the other room. When the sun came up, he made coffee and fried cornmeal mush in the skillet. He put a plate of it on a tray with a fork and another cup of water and carried it to the small room. She was awake, sitting with her back against the wall and the blankets still wrapped around her. Her eyes tracked him as he entered. Pabrafar. He set the tray on the table. You should eat. Pafarfar. She looked at the food, then at him. She didn't move. These sections. Elias nodded and backed out of the room. He ate his own breakfast, standing at the counter, listening. After a few minutes, he heard the scrape of the fork against the plate. Sections. The days that followed fell into a pattern. He left food at her door 3 times a day. She ate it. He brought fresh water. She drank it. He washed her clothes and left them folded on the chair in her room. She dressed. but she didn't speak and she didn't leave the room. Part 4. On the 4th day, he came in from the morning chores and found her standing in the main room. She was dressed in her own clothes, the dark dress mended with small, neat stitches he hadn't made. Her hair was braided and hung over one shoulder. She was looking at the hearth, at the cold ashes from the night before. Poire Elias stopped in the doorway. Morning. Perpoire. She turned to look at him. Yet her face was still bruised, but the swelling had gone down. She gestured to the hearth, then to the woodpile beside it, then back to the hearth. The meaning was clear. "I'll build it up," Elias said. "I was just about to." She shook her head. She pointed to herself, then to the hearth. "You want to do it?" She nodded. Elias stepped aside. She moved past him to the woodpile and selected 3 pieces with the care of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. She knelt by the hearth and built the fire with a precision that made his own fire-building look like the work of a child. She used bark for tinder, arranged the kindling in a small pyramid, and placed the larger pieces in a structure that would draw air and burn hot. She struck his flint and steel on the first try, and the fire caught and spread in sections. She stood and brushed the bark from her hands. She looked at him, and for the first time, something like satisfaction crossed her face. "Sections, that's a good fire," Elias said. Horror. She nodded once and went back to the small room. Hours after that, she began to emerge more often. She didn't speak, but she moved through the cabin like she was learning its geography. She watched him make coffee, and the next morning she made it herself, stronger and better than his. She saw him washing his plate and cup, and the next day he came in to find all the dishes washed and stacked. She found the broom in the corner and swept the floor. She discovered the small vegetable patch behind the cabin, choked with weeds and long neglected, and she spent an entire afternoon on her knees pulling the weeds and turning the soil with her hands. In sections, Elias watched from a distance and said nothing. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what she was doing here, or where she'd come from, or why she'd been in the creek half dead. He didn't know if she planned to stay, or if she was just waiting for strength enough to leave. But he knew she was changing his world in small, irreversible ways. The cabin smelled different. It smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and the faint green scent of the herbs she'd found growing wild by the creek and hung to dry from the rafters. It looked different. The floor was clean. The dishes were stacked. The hearth was tended. It felt different. Parfumor. On the 8th day, he left a pair of boots by the back door. They'd been Sarah's, small and sturdy, and they'd sat in the chest unused for 6 years. He didn't say anything about them. Why, he just left them there and went out to work. Sections. When he came back in the evening, the boots were gone. She was wearing them, standing in the garden with dirt on her hands and a small pile of carrots on the ground beside her. The carrots were thin and twisted, barely worth eating, but she'd pulled them and washed them and laid them out like they were treasure. Pichabravar. She looked up at him and gestured to the carrots, then to the cabin. An offering. "I'll cook them," Elias said. "Thank you." Piapiro. She nodded and went back to her work. That night, he made a stew with the carrots and some dried beef and an onion from his stores. It was better than anything he'd eaten in months, maybe years. He filled 2 bowls and set one on the table across from his own chair. She came out of the small room when he called and sat down. Both they ate in silence, but it was a different silence than the one he'd lived in for 6 years. It was full instead of empty. Sections Red was the one who broke the last barrier. The big roan gelding was not a friendly horse. He tolerated Elias because Elias fed him and didn't ask for more than he could give, but he didn't tolerate anyone else. When the farrier came out from town twice a year, it took 2 men to hold Red's head while his hooves were trimmed. Elias was mending the pasture fence when he heard her voice for the first time. It wasn't English. It was something else, soft and rhythmic, rising and falling like a song. He straightened and looked toward the barn. She was standing at the fence with Red's big head lowered to her shoulder. The horse's eyes were half closed and his ears were relaxed. She was singing to him, in one hand on his neck, the other stroking the white blaze down his nose. Sections, Elias walked closer, slow and quiet. Red's ear flicked toward him, but the horse didn't lift his head. She kept singing, the words incomprehensible, but the melody clear and sweet. When she finished, she pressed her forehead to Red's cheek, and the horse blew out a soft breath. She turned and saw Elias watching. She didn't look embarrassed or caught. She just looked at him, then at the horse, then back at him. "Parfor, he likes you," Elias said. "Parfor." She tilted her head slightly, like she was trying to understand. "Mafapar." Elias pointed to Red, then to her, then smiled. "He doesn't like anyone, but he likes you." Far, she looked at the horse again, and something softened in her face. She reached up and scratched behind Red's ear, and the gelding leaned into her hand like a dog. Sections that evening, Elias left a currycomb and a hoof-pick on the bench outside the barn. The next morning they were back in their places, and Red's coat was brushed to a shine. Parathurst. The town was 12 miles south, a collection of wooden buildings and dirt streets that called itself Forsyth and served the ranches and homesteads scattered across the territory. Elias went once a month for supplies: flour, coffee, sugar, salt, nails, whatever he couldn't make or grow himself. He didn't linger. He bought what he needed, loaded it into the wagon, and left. He hadn't been in 3 months. He was low on everything. On the morning of the 23rd day after he'd pulled her from the creek, he hitched Red to the wagon and loaded the empty sacks. She was in the garden when he came around the cabin. She looked up at the sound of the harness and stood. "Paragraph, I'm going to town," Elias said. "I'll be back before dark." Paragraph. She walked toward him, her steps quick. When she reached the wagon, she looked at him and then at the road south. Her face was tight. "You'll be all right here," Elias said. "There's food in the cabin. The rifle's over the door if you need it." Later, she shook her head. She pointed south, then to herself, then made a gesture he didn't understand, her hands moving in a quick, cutting motion. "Peror, I don't—" Elias started. Peror, she grabbed his arm. Her grip was strong. She looked up at him and spoke, her voice low and urgent, the words in her own language tumbling over each other, too fast for him to catch even a syllable. "I don't understand," Elias said. "Sections." She let go of his arm and stepped back. She took a breath. When she spoke again, it was in English, the words slow and careful and shaped with effort. "Sections, they will come for me." Sections, Elias went still. It was the first English she'd spoken. 4 words, and they hit him like a fist. "Paraforth." "Who?" he said. "Parafort." She looked south again, toward the town, toward something beyond it. "Men," she said. "Bad men." "Why?" She touched her own chest. "I ran. They want me back." Elias felt something cold settle in his gut. "What did they do to you?" "Parafor." She didn't answer. She just looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, and he saw the bruise on her temple and the scar above her eye, and understood that what they'd done was written on her body, and he didn't need to ask again. "Let them come," he said. She blinked. "You do not understand. They are many. You are one. Sections. Let them come, Elias said again. He reached into the wagon bed and pulled out the rifle, checked the load, and set it back. This is my land. You're under my roof. They want you. They go through me. Parabra. She stared at him. You will die. Parabra. Maybe, Elias said, but they won't take you. Parabra. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she stepped forward and placed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart. The touch was brief, but it burned through his shirt like a brand. She pulled her hand back and nodded once. I stay, she said. Elias went to town. He bought his supplies and loaded them quickly. The storekeeper, a thin man named Howell, watched him work. You're in a hurry today, Kane. Got work waiting, Elias said. Heard you got company out at your place. Elias stopped. He looked at Howell. Where'd you hear that? Howell shrugged. Talk travels. Some men came through last week asking about a runaway squaw. Said she stole from them. Said if anyone saw her, they'd pay for information. Perprovor. What did you tell them? Perprovorum. Told them I hadn't seen any Indians in months. Howell leaned on the counter. But if I had, I'd tell them a man's got a right to his own business on his own land. Elias nodded slowly. Appreciate that. Perba. Those men were rough, Kane, the kind that don't ask twice. Perbatwo. I know the kind, Elias said. He paid for his supplies and left. He pushed Red hard on the way back. The gelding sensed his urgency and stretched into a trot that ate the miles. The sun was still high when Elias turned onto the track that led to his cabin. Everything looked quiet. Normal. He didn't trust it. She was waiting on the porch. When she saw him, she stood. He pulled the wagon up and climbed down. They've been asking about you in town. I know, she said. They will come soon. How do you know? Prapaprao. She pointed to the east, toward the ridge that overlooked his valley. I see them. This morning, 3 men, watching. Paraprav Elias felt his jaw tighten. Why didn't you run? Paraprav. She looked at him like he'd asked why the sun rose. You said, let them come. I said that, so you wouldn't be afraid. I didn't mean... Parched, I am not afraid, she said. She said it simply, like it was a fact. I run before. I am tired of running. Barbara. Elias looked at her. See this small woman in a mended dress and his dead wife's boots, standing on his porch with her chin up and her eyes clear. All right, he said. Then we don't run. Barbara. They came 2 days later, just after dawn. Elias heard the horses before he saw them. 3 riders coming down the track at an easy walk. He was already awake, already dressed, the rifle loaded and leaning against the wall by the door. She was in the kitchen, making coffee. When she heard the hooves, she set the pot down and came to stand beside him. Stay inside, Elias said. No. He looked at her. This is going to get ugly. I know, she said. She reached past him and took the rifle. She checked the load with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, then handed it back to him. I stay beside you, Pinarfar. Elias wanted to argue. He didn't. Yet he opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. She followed. Sections. The 3 men pulled up 20 feet from the cabin. They were exactly what Elias had expected. Hard-faced, unshaven, wearing guns like tools. The one in the middle was older, maybe 50, with a scar that ran from his ear to his jaw. He smiled when he saw her. Parafor. There she is, and he said, Thought we lost you, girl. Parafor. She didn't speak. She stood beside Elias, her hands at her sides, her face empty. Parafor. We've been looking for you, the man continued. You ran off with something that belongs to us. We want it back. Parafor. She doesn't have anything of yours, Elias said. Porfoir. The man's eyes shifted to him. Who the hell are you? Porfoir. I'm the man who owns this land. You're on it. You need to leave. Porfoir. The man laughed. That's real hospitable. We just want what's ours. The squaw stole a horse and some supplies when she ran. We're willing to overlook it if she comes back quiet. She's not going anywhere, Elias said. The man's smile faded. You don't know what you're getting into, friend. That woman is property. She was sold to us fair and square by her own people. We got papers. Paragraph 4. I don't care about your papers, Elias said. She's under my protection. You want her? You'll have to kill me first. Paragraph 4. The two men on either side of the scarred man shifted in their saddles. Their hands moved toward their guns. The scarred man held up a hand. Now hold on, he said. No need for that kind of talk. We're reasonable men. Maybe we can work something out. What did you pay for her? I didn't pay anything. She's not for sale. Everything's for sale, friend. Name your price. Sections. Elias raised the rifle. It was a smooth, unhurried movement, and when it was done, the barrel was pointed at the scarred man's chest. Get off my land, Parabrafre. The scarred man's face went hard. You're making a mistake, Parabrafre. Won't be my first, Parabrafre. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the scarred man pulled his reins and turned his horse. The other two followed. But before they rode off, the scarred man looked back at her. Parabrafre, we'll be back, girl, and next time we won't ask nice. Parabrafre. They rode north, back the way they'd come. Elias didn't lower the rifle until they were out of sight. When he finally did, his hands were shaking. Porfoir, she touched his arm. They will come back. I know, Pinat, with more men. Pamar, probably. She looked up at him. Why do you do this? Pedro. Elias didn't have an answer that made sense. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from, or what she'd suffered, or what she wanted from life. He only knew that she'd brought his house back to life, that Red trusted her, that her coffee was better than his, and her fire building was an art, and her voice when she sang was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. He knew that the thought of those men putting their hands on her made him want to burn the world down. Parafour, because it's right, he said. Par. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached up and touched his face, her palm against his cheek. Elias, she said. It was the first time she'd said his name. My name is Ayana. Ayana, he repeated. She nodded. It means eternal blossom. She smiled, small and sad. My mother's hope. Not true, Parafour. It's true, Elias said. You brought life back to this place. You brought it back to me. Parafour, her eyes filled. She didn't look away. They will kill you, Elias. Parafour, let them try. They came back 4 days later with 7 men. Elias saw them coming from a mile off, a line of riders raising dust against the morning sun. He'd been ready. He'd spent the days since the first visit preparing, loading every gun he owned, stacking ammunition, filling barrels with water in case they tried to burn him out. He'd sent Ayana into town with a letter for the sheriff, though he didn't expect help. The law in Forsyth was one old man with a bad leg and no interest in getting killed over an Indian woman. Sections Ayana had refused to go. She'd torn the letter in half and thrown it in the fire. I will not hide, she'd said. Not anymore. So they stood together on the porch, Elias with the rifle and Ayana with the shotgun he'd taught her to load. Red was in the barn, the door barred from the inside. The cattle were in the far pasture. Everything that could be saved had been saved. 4. The 7 men stopped at the same place the 3 had stopped before. The scarred man was in the lead again, but this time he wasn't smiling. "Last chance, Kane," he called out. "Hand her over and we'll leave you be." "No," Elias said. "You're a fool. Been called worse." The scarred man sighed. "All right then. Boys, take her." The men dismounted. They spread out, moving to flank the cabin. Elias fired. The shot took the man on the far right in the shoulder and spun him around. He went down screaming. The others dove for cover. "Next one's in the chest," Elias shouted. For a moment there was silence. Then the scarred man's voice came from behind a water trough. "You can't hold us off forever, Kane. We'll burn you out if we have to." "War, try it." Perver. One of the men broke from cover, running low toward the side of the cabin. Ayanna's shotgun roared. The blast caught him in the legs and he went down hard, rolling and clutching his thigh. She broke the shotgun open, ejected the spent shells, and reloaded with hands that didn't shake. Prrr. Elias looked at her. She looked back. "I told you," she said. "I am not afraid." Prrr. The fight lasted 2 hours. It was ugly, brutal work, shooting at shadows, reloading in the spaces between volleys, the air thick with gun smoke and the smell of blood. Even one of the attackers made it to the barn and tried to set it on fire. Elias shot him through the door, and the man fell across the threshold, his torch guttering out in the dirt. Another tried to circle around through the creek bed. Ayanna saw him coming and put a load of buckshot into the water 3 feet in front of him. He ran. By midday, 3 of the 7 were down, 1 dead, 2 wounded badly enough that they couldn't fight. The others had pulled back to the tree line, out of rifle range. Elias could see them talking, arguing. The scarred man was gesturing, his face red. "They will wait for dark," Ayanna said. She was sitting with her back against the cabin wall, the shotgun across her knees. There was a cut on her cheek from a splinter of wood blown off the doorframe by a bullet. She didn't seem to notice it. "Sections, probably," Elias said. He was reloading the rifle, his fingers moving by feel. His shoulder ached from the recoil, and his ears were ringing. "We cannot fight in the dark." "No," she looked at him. "You should let me go to them." "No." "Elias, no." He set the rifle down and turned to face her. "I'm not letting you go. I'm not letting them take you. I don't care if it's 4 men or 40. You're staying here. With me, Parafor." She stared at him. "Why, Parafor?" "Because I love you," Elias said. The words came out rough and unplanned, but they were true. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. But I do. And I'm not giving you up." Sections, Ayanna's eyes went wide. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief and fierce, and tasted like gun smoke and dust, and something sweet underneath. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. "I love you too," she said. "Stupid man." Elias laughed. It was a short, startled sound, completely inappropriate for the situation, but he couldn't help it. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Sections. The sound of hoofbeats made them both turn. A group of riders was coming from the south. 5 men, moving fast. Elias raised the rifle, then lowered it. He recognized the lead horse. It was Howell's gray mare. Payror, the storekeeper, pulled up in front of the cabin and dismounted. Behind him were 4 other men from town: the blacksmith, the farrier, a homesteader named Briggs, and old Sheriff Talbot on a mule. They were all armed. "Heard you had trouble, Kane," Howell said. Elias stared. "How?" "Your lady came into town 3 days ago. Didn't say a word. Just showed me a drawing she'd made of those men, and pointed north. I figured it out." Howell looked at the bodies in the yard. the wounded men crawling toward the tree line. "Looks like we're late." "Not too late," Elias said. He pointed toward the trees. "4 more up there. They're planning to wait for dark." Sheriff Talbot spat. "The hell they are." He raised his voice. "You men in the trees, this is Sheriff Talbot. You got 10 seconds to mount up and ride out, or I'm deputizing every man here and we're coming in." There was a long silence. Then the scarred man's voice, thin with rage. "This ain't your business, Sheriff, for it is now. 10 seconds." The 4 men came out of the trees with their hands up. They mounted their horses and rode north without looking back. The 2 wounded men in the yard crawled onto their horses and followed. The dead man stayed where he was. Sections, Talbot watched them go, then turned to Elias. "You all right?" "Yeah," Elias said. "Thanks to you." "Thank her," Talbot said, nodding at Ayanna. "She walked into town like she owned it, showed Howell that drawing, and stood there until he agreed to get help. Didn't say a word. Didn't have to. Perfor." Elias looked at Ayanna. She shrugged, a small smile on her lips. Howell cleared his throat. "Kane, you planning to marry that woman?" "Paprar." Elias blinked. Paprar, because if you are, you should do it soon. Legal wife's got protections. Property can't be stolen from a man's wife, not even an Indian wife." Sections Elias looked at Ayanna. "What do you think?" "Sections," she tilted her head. "You ask me to marry you?" "I'm asking." "Then I say yes," Talbot grinned. "Well, hell, I can do the ceremony right now if you want. I'm authorized." And so they were married on the porch of Elias Kane's cabin, with gun smoke still hanging in the air and blood drying in the dirt, and 5 witnesses who'd ridden 12 miles to help a man most of them barely knew, defend a woman none of them had met. Talbot spoke the words from memory, short and simple. Elias repeated them. Ayanna repeated them, her English careful and clear. When Talbot said, "You may kiss your bride," Elias did, and this time the kiss was soft and slow and full of promise. Sections. The men from town stayed long enough to help bury the dead man and patch the bullet holes in the cabin walls. Then they rode back south, Howell tipping his hat to Ayanna as he left. "Welcome to Forsyth, Mrs. Kane." Sections. When they were alone, Elias and Ayanna stood in the yard and looked at the wreckage of the day. The cabin was scarred but standing. The barn was intact. Red nickered from inside, impatient to be let out. "We should fix the door," Ayanna said. "Tomorrow," Elias said. "Tonight, I just want to sit with my wife." "Parar." She smiled. "Your wife. I like this word." "Bar." They sat on the porch as the sun went down, her hand in his, the silence between them full and warm. Red came out of the barn and walked over to the porch, nosing at Ayanna's shoulder until she scratched his ears. The big gelding sighed and stood with his head in her lap, his eyes half closed. "He knows," Ayanna said. "Knows what?" "That I am home." Elias looked at her, at the cabin behind them, watched at the land stretching out in all directions. "Yeah," he said. "So am I." Sections. The seasons turned. Winter came hard and cold, but the cabin was warm. Ayanna filled it with the smell of cooking food and burning sage, and the sound of her voice singing in her own language while she worked. She taught Elias words in her tongue, and he taught her more English, and slowly they built a language that was only theirs, a mix of both worlds. Porer. In the spring, she planted the garden in earnest, and by summer it was thick with vegetables and herbs that Elias had never seen before. She traded them in town for cloth and thread and seeds, and the women who'd once looked at her with suspicion began to ask her advice on growing things in the hard Montana soil. Sections. Howell spread the word that anyone who bothered Mrs. Kane would answer to him, and since Howell extended credit to half the territory, people listened. The scarred man and his crew were never seen again. Sections. Elias added a room onto the cabin, framing it out with logs he cut himself and raising the walls with Ayanna working beside him, handing him nails and holding the boards steady. When it was done, she filled it with light and color, hanging woven blankets on the walls and carving small figures from wood that she placed on the windowsills. For on their first anniversary, she gave him a son. Elias held the baby in his big scarred hands and felt something crack open in his chest that he thought was sealed forever. Ayanna named the boy in her own language first, a name that meant new beginning, and then gave him an English name too. Samuel, after Elias's father. Petrarcho. They raised him together on that hard, not beautiful land, teaching him to work and to love, and to stand up for what was right even when it cost him. And when he was old enough to ask, they told him the story of how they met, how his mother had been pulled from a creek more dead than alive, and how his father had said, "Let them come," and how love had grown in the spaces between silence and work and trust. Sections. And every night when the work was done and the fire was banked and the stars were bright over the Montana grasslands, Elias Kane sat on his porch with his wife's hand in his and knew that he was the richest man alive. Sections. Thank you for listening to this story. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. They're about quiet decency, about standing firm when it would be easier to walk away. It can about two people building a life, one trust-filled moment at a time. If this story moved you, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling these stories. What would you have done in Elias's place? Would you have stood your ground? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one.